sale. Peggy's got books for sale too, so anyway. But Peggy has become a big part of our World War Roundtable, and a very spirited young lady here. Are you going to need this mic?
I don't think so. Do I need it?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. In case you're wondering, how did I get here? It was my husband that knew about the Red Ball Express. He read a lot of World War II magazines, and he thought it would be an interesting topic for the student outreach group of the World War II Roundtable. And then Connie insisted that I come here today. So that's how I got here. How many of you have heard of the Red Ball Express? Okay, just about all of you, of course. Well, then you know that it played a critical role in winning the war. Let me go through a little bit about this today. One question for you. Who was it that said, men, they can eat their belts. My tanks, they gotta have gas. Patton, okay. Well, the last group didn't answer, so I'm impressed with this group, and I'm not surprised. So let me back up just a little bit here. To back up D-Day, you know all about D-Day, but this is where it sort of began. As you know, that there were 1 million tons of supplies sent every month in anticipation of D-Day. And they would bring over 1 million soldiers too. But just weeks after landing on Normandy, there were some storms. Some of the beaches were closed. They would be stalled. And they would be stalled for a while there in Normandy. Not to mention the vicious German fighters, and not to mention battling through the hedgerows, right? Well, eventually, in late July, the Allies had a series of initiatives that would finally get them to break out of Normandy. And they had not anticipated that the Germans would retreat as quickly as they did. So certainly the Allies went after them. But at the time, the roads were in very bad shape. As you can imagine, in anticipation of the D-Day landings, they had bombed the roads. They had bombed the railways. So what would be unavailable to the Germans would also be unavailable to the Allies. But as the Allies went after the Germans, their supply line was stretched. So this is a situation that Ernie Pyle would call a tactician's hell and a quartermaster's nightmare. How were they supposed to get their supplies? And the 1st and 3rd Army would need 800,000 gallons per day in just gasoline. Doesn't take long to figure out that something needed to be done, and it needed to be done right away. They needed a plan. So here's who they put into that. Lieutenant Colonel Loren Ayers. Anyone know what this fellow's nickname was? I'll tell you. They called him Little Patton. He and other men sat around a table for 36 hours straight and finally came up with the plan. They would call it the Red Ball Express. Red Ball was an old railway term that they used to say expedite, or tout suite, as they say in France, right away. With all these clogged roads, they had a new idea. They would come up with a giant loop, and it would go from St. Lo to Chartres and back. The northern route would go east, and the southern route would go west. One-way traffic only. And what did they do? They put signs on the road. Here's an example of the sign. They would mark the trucks with a red disc, so they knew who was able to be on the road and who wasn't. The plan was to go initially in convoys, certainly 20 or so, 55 meters in between, a little truck out front to give them some direction. This was the start of the plan, and as they went through this, things actually evolved and always got better. The initial plan was the driver there and then someone with a machine gun. That went out the window pretty quickly because they needed just 2 drivers. That was the mainstay here. Don't forget that the Army at the time was a segregated Army. 3 out of the 4 men that drove trucks were black African Americans. And they needed a lot more drivers and they needed a lot more help. Certainly they needed maintenance workers. Certainly they needed a lot of others. So they went for volunteers. What happens in the Army when they ask for volunteers? Well, I'm not in the Army, but what I've heard is that nobody volunteers. Well, this was a bit of a different situation. As you can imagine, some of these soldiers had been sitting, literally standing in the rain on the beaches, waiting for assignment. So they said they would take just about any way. In fact, you didn't even have to have driven a vehicle, and you could be qualified to do this job. Sounds like some other jobs, right? So they did get the volunteers. They also had maps flown in from England so that people knew where they were going. And they mimeographed, remember that term? Mimeographed the rules of the road so everybody knew what to do. So this was the setup of the Red Ball Express. And military police was needed. Okay, you've got all these trucks going down the highway. Only authorized people, right? Only authorized trucks. Well, what's the quick way for an itty-bitty little French truck to get from here to there? Well, get in between one of these trucks. But certainly there were stories of those little bitty cars getting smashed in the Red Ball Express. So the military police were there, and they also did a lot of redirecting because things would change. And so somebody needed to be there to help with that. They also helped with the speed limit. Now, they said that the average was maybe 25 to 45 miles per hour. But think about that. If you got into a little town, you would be slowed to 10 to 15 miles an hour. So what would you do if you had to make up that time? The other thing that happened is there were a lot of delays at some of the depots. It would take a really long time to load and unload. In fact, a lot of times they didn't even wait for the convoy, they would just take off. But don't forget, it's little Patton in charge of this. What do you think their deadlines were like? I can only imagine. In fact, the roads became much like a stock car race. The British would joke, if you saw the Red Ball Express coming, not only do you need to get out of the way, you need to get out of the way and climb a tree just to be safe. There were stories of the 2-man team while they were driving down the road at this fast pace. That's when they changed drivers. Oh my goodness, right? This was a dangerous situation. Now, as you recall, at this time in France, there was a blackout underway, right? So they could not use headlights to illuminate the highway. They could only use them to identify that a truck was there. And then in the back, there were no white lights. There was a ruby cat eye, they called it. And one of the drivers said it would absolutely hypnotize you to watch this all night long. Certainly maintenance was required, but do you suppose they paid a lot of attention to maintenance? Well, not likely. Again, a lot of these people were brand new drivers, had the minimum of training. So, gears would grind, transmissions messed up, batteries dried up, motors burned, you name it, it happened. They also tended to overload the trucks. Now, why do they do this? You can imagine if you put a layer of shells on a truck, it wouldn't take long before you met your load requirements. In fact, a 2.5-ton truck, their load was actually doubled before D-Day, that they could bring an even higher load. And even on top of that, they would still overload the trucks. Once again, Patton needed his gas, right? And then spare parts. Everything in the US had been sent overseas, right? What was the first thing to be rationed in the United States? At least what I heard. Anyone guess?
Tires.
Tires, absolutely. Well, that's what I read. You can imagine the need for tires. In fact, in the first couple of months, they went through something like 29,000 tires. And then the next few months, 55,000 tires. And what was one of the biggest problems? Why were the tires so quickly worn out? Any ideas here? What's that? Bad roads. Anything else?
Overloading.
What's that?
Overloading.
Overloading, but also those cans in the C rations were strewn everywhere. At least that's what I heard. These cans really played a number on these tires. And certainly tires back then weren't as good as tires today. Now these were some dangerous routes. A lot of times they would go to some of the smaller villages that had literally been bombed. There would be dead and decaying livestock there. There would be dead and decaying soldiers. There would be a danger of mines, a danger of snipers, not to mention the Luftwaffe as well. These were some difficult routes that they did. And then at this time, we know the weather played a big role. It was uncharacteristically wet. The rains just kept coming. Well, what did that do? Well, there were creeks that they couldn't cross. There were roads and bridges that were washed away, not to mention some of their depot areas where they stored a lot of the supplies were no longer available and had to be rerouted. You can see the mud, as we hear a lot about. The mud was unbearable. Take a look at this truck here. You'll notice too that the windshield here is up. A lot of times they would take off the windshield because they could see better, but also they didn't want the glint of the windshield being in the eyes of the Luftwaffe. For the return trip, often they would bring German POWs back towards the beaches. They also brought back some of the fallen soldiers. Apparently, that smell of death was really something to get out of those trucks. And then, when you have a situation like this, where you have a low number of supplies and an extremely high demand, you're just asking for the black market, right? So how were these guys maybe paid off? How did they somehow give away some of their supplies? Well, you can imagine what happened there. What was the number one supply by weight on these trucks? Anyone guess? Gasoline, absolutely. Over 50% of the supplies on these trucks was gasoline. And how much could you get for a jerry can of gasoline during the war? Any guesses? $100. And what do paratroopers get? $50 a month pay, $50 extra, so a full month pay for a paratrooper would buy you a jerry can of gas. So let's talk gasoline. How many of you have one of these in your garage? You might actually recognize this. This is what they called the Wehrmacht canister. Did I get it right, Bill? Am I even close? The Armed Forces Unit canister. As the story goes, in 1937, it was Adolf Hitler that wanted something better for carrying liquids in the war. He wanted a slick design, so he put out a competition. And the guy that won came up with this as a solution. There's more than meets the eye on this. This is simply genius. Let me explain a few things in case you hadn't noticed. First of all, this would be stamped seal, and it was welded together. And notice that the seam is on the inside. That's not easily broken out. The other thing was a distinctive ribbing here that meant in cold or hot it could reduce or expand. Notice the handles here. It's a 3-handle system, they called it. Now these weighed about 45 pounds each. That meant that one soldier in each hand could carry 2 of them, or 1 in each hand, right? Or if they wanted to share with someone, 2 people could handle it. Or if you wanted to pass it on to someone, 2 people, you could pass it that way. The other thing about these handles is with this, if the canisters were empty, you could grab easily 2 of them at a time. So one person could carry 4 empty canisters. There was also a very intricate closure here. The lid on this didn't come off and get lost. It came up and out and was still secured to the canister. There was an air vent too that made it easier to pour. There was an air chamber in the top which allowed these things to float. Quite the design, right? So the question is, did the Americans have these? Well, the story I heard was that an American engineer in 1939 had built himself a car. He went to Italy and he met his German friend in Italy where they would tour around Italy. His German friend knew that his friend didn't have any storage for water in this new car. So he brought along some of these canisters, 3 of them, and the designs from Germany. And they had a good time until their trip was cut short and they both went to their homes. So the American engineer brought these designs to the Army and tried to get some traction. It didn't work. Eventually he knew he had to show them one of these canisters. His car at that time was in storage in Italy. So he had this truck or the car shipped home so he could get out these canisters and then show the Army. So then they took off and finally made the design. A little bit different, but they were as stackable as the German ones. A little bit lighter is what I understand. And they would need, they would sure need a lot of these. What was the British canister called? Anybody know or remember? The flimsy. What a contrast, right? This was more like a muffin tin. In fact, it was made out of tin, and it was crimped at the seams, and it was said that it lost as much as 25% of its volume in transport. And then over the rough terrain of northern Africa, it would puncture very easily and again fall apart. There is at least one story of a ship that was blown up because of the leakage of these cans into the hull of the ship. But there was one good use for this. They could cut it off, put holes in it, put gravel in it, gasoline in it, and voila. They had the Benghazi burner that you've probably heard of, that they talk about, that they could then warm up their Spam dinners. So they needed 12 million of the canisters. What were the other names for the canisters? The jerry or the jerry cans, yep. They needed 12 million of these, and they were 3 million short. In fact, there were times when they didn't have enough canisters and the trucks weren't going to roll because they didn't have anything to put the gasoline in. So this, okay, the workhorse of the war. This is, as many of you know, The GMC CCKW, this was it. C, designed in 1941, conventional cab, K, all-wheel drive, W, dual rear axles, and X was the experimental one. This was actually originally built in 1939 for the French Army and then was modified. And actually 50 years later, a lot of these were upgraded and still able to go and meet the highway requirements. There are a lot of variations of this. You can see up there they had open or closed cab. They had long wheelbases, short wheelbases. 1 in 4 had a machine gun mounted above the passenger side. Of the 2.4 million trucks made, about a third of them were the 2.5-ton truck, or 812,000, and 560,000 of these were the GMC truck. It was great on rough terrain. There were at least 20 different standardized bodies. They had everything from a dental operating van, surgical van, water purification van, welder's truck, dump truck, fire truck. Here is a picture of the chemical warfare truck. This would be the monster truck. Diamond T model, 12-ton 6x4. This thing could move anything. It pulled 120,000 pounds, or at least over 10 times the capacity of the 2.5-ton truck. Top speed on this, 30 miles an hour. Now here's a truck many of you can recognize. How many of you, with a show of hands, have been in one of these trucks? Yes, several of you. Okay, so this is the D 1942 design, U utility, K all-wheel drive, W tandem rear axles. Okay, the amphibious truck with the hull designed by an American Cup winner. Boy, it's not every truck that can boast that, right? Well, the story on this one that I heard is that a man in Milwaukee who ran a trucking business heard that there was a surplus of trucks that out in California where he could go and buy some. So he went out to California to buy a truck, and lo and behold, this is what he came across. So against all common sense, he bought a truck. He got home to Wisconsin and was not met with open arms with his wife or his friends. They thought he'd really lost it. But he brought him out on Lake Michigan, and luckily somebody knew something about the plugs, otherwise their first voyage would have been their last. He pulled some seats from a bus company so that they had seating. So they went out on Lake Michigan. One of the guys on the trip said, you know, there's a place called the Wisconsin Dells where every day is a Sunday. So sure enough, he brought this over to the Wisconsin Dells, and now many of us have been able to get on a vintage World War II truck. In fact, he has 95 of them still in operation. There are 300 of these still in the U.S., in Branson, Missouri, and I think there's a place in Arkansas that has them as well. Now, in Germany, this one you'll recognize, the Opel. The Opel's been around for some time, long before the war. In 1930, they came up with this new model. It was sturdy and affordable. And they wanted high profile with this. So they had a competition. They had a competition to name this truck. And they had 1.5 million entries, with first prize an Opel limousine and other prizes, a lot of Opel motorcycles. But what was the winner? They wanted a short 5-letter title that could be understood in several languages. So what was the winner? The Blitz. This is the Blitz that would put the Blitz in the Blitzkrieg. They have their telltale logo here. It looks kind of like lightning. And this is the one, actually, they were a subsidiary of General Motors. So throughout the war, they were able to interchange parts with some of the other trucks that they would find, interestingly enough. Let's see. In 1934, they built in Brandenburg a facility. It was 850,000 square meters. And in 1939 was their highest production of this truck. And who knows when the Brandenburg facility was bombed? Early in August 1944. So about the time we're talking about is the time that this very same Brandenburg facility would be bombed. So they made something like 130,000 of these. This, again, the most popular model. Now, if they made 130,000 and there were 560,000 of these 2.5-ton trucks, what would be the difference there? Any ideas here? How could Germany get by on so few trucks? Anyone know? Well, you do know, I think, but you just don't know that you know. 80% of the German army actually relied on horses. Hard to believe, and we don't see much about it, but this is how they rolled. As you can see, a picture here, the infantry was on foot, and the artillery was often pulled by the horses. And why did they do this? Well, certainly they might have thought that the horses would be cheaper, although it wasn't that cheap. They still had to be fed, they had to be cared for, and then people started to care for the horses too. That was a bit of a problem. But why did they do this? It was limited fuel access. The Americans had Texas, Arizona, Oklahoma for fuel, right? The British had the Middle East, right? But what did Germany have? They didn't have access to the fuel like the others did. Comment? What? Okay, yep. But I think it was really a challenge for Germany, always a big challenge for Germany, is what I understood. So eventually, the Red Ball Express, their job would come to an end. They had done what they needed to do. They had moved 5,000 tons a day. And eventually, Paris was liberated in late August, and it became a hub for sustainment. And then the other ports became open. So Le Havre was open, Rouen, Cherbourg, even Marseille, and even Antwerp. The trains started rolling again, so there wasn't as much need for this. But there were some other channels, as you can see here. There was something called the Little Red Ball. This one would go straight from Normandy to Paris. There would be the ABC Express route. This was Antwerp, Brussels. And then the XYZ route would go directly into Germany. As you can imagine, the rails in Germany were not helpful at all. So there were some new routes. There was also some other needs for the trucks. As you know, in December with Battle of the Bulge, they called upon the 101st and the 82nd Airborne, right? Well, they weren't exactly flown in there, were they? No, they were brought by trucks. And there was a lot of storage depots of gasoline there. So this time, the trucks didn't bring gasoline to the area, but they brought it away from the area to not get it into the hands of the Germans. Let's see, then in 1944, Life magazine called the Red Ball Express the miracle of American tradition. America, who was accustomed to open spaces, endless roads, and automobiles, came up with a very unique solution. Can you imagine if you had been a German POW sitting on the beaches at Normandy, watching ship after ship come in and truck after truck get unloaded? Sit there and watch this. Can you imagine what went through their head? Maybe even including, where are the horses? So Eisenhower would champion something like the Red Ball Express in 1955. Anyone know what that would be? The Interstate Highway. He was the champion of the Interstate Highway. I believe it was part of the War Department at the time, and it was not to get supplies somewhere, but in the case of a horrific event, how would you get civilians quickly away from an area? So that's how that started. And then also a lasting legacy for Eisenhower. This is near Chicago. It was renamed, the expressway was called, the turnpike was renamed the Ike, and that's what it's called today. Well, finally, I think Patton sums it up the best. He commented that the 2.5-ton truck, and of course its drivers, was our most important weapon in the war. They could move anything, anywhere, anytime. That's it.
Say, Peg,
Yes.
help me. It almost took a gallon of gas to bring a gallon forward. Is that?
Well, I don't know the specifics. Maybe somebody else does, but that was definitely an issue because, yeah, it would take gas to get gas, and 800,000 gallons a day. I mean, you couldn't even load that on one truck. You needed at least like 20 trucks to load that up. So I don't know what it took, but this was quite an endeavor.
But it was really a consuming gallons of gas just to get the gas there.
Just to get them there, and with all the maintenance and everything
And
else.
The other thing, because all the bridges had been bombed and blown, they didn't have enough engineers
Yep,
to build the roads or to maintain.
right, right. They needed a lot of people, engineers and, yep. Any other comments?
Biggest complaint that Montgomery was getting all the gas.
Oh, okay,
And Patton was getting the gas.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that we'll emphasize on our trip.
yeah. I've heard that. In fact, I heard, or it was in the movie, I'm not sure which, but Patton at one point was actually out there directing traffic because he wanted the gas to go to certain places, and there was actually some other comments from some of the soldiers that were unloading that General Patton too. He would be out there unloading the gas. That's just how valuable this was. Other comments?
Well, be sure.
Yes, Jim.
Be sure and tell people.
Oh, I will.
that you're a part of that middle program.
Okay, I'm happy to be a part of that. Yes, Mr. Rasmussen.
Well, you mentioned the GMC a lot. Did you
Yes.
run into anything about the number of Studebakers? Because it seems to me, I always remember running into Studebakers and never found a GM.
Well, I don't know the specifics. This was the biggest one of what I came across. So just to simplify, I just stayed with that. But there were several different companies that were making, but it seems like the majority of them, 2.5-ton, 6x6 trucks.
A lot of
So-
the Studebakers were actually shipped to Russia.
Well, yeah, but that was but the only ones I saw in the Army and whatnot, even during Korea was Studebakers, yeah.
Okay, okay. Well, yeah, a lot of these things were, yeah, they went over to Russia, the trucks did. But anyway, other comments? Yes?
It's just that how many wars have been lost because of the extension of supply lines?
Yeah,
You get your supply line too long, you don't get the supplies, you can't fight. You
right.
need your gas to fight by World War II.
Well, don't they say, one of the other authors said that logistics is such a boring word and no one ever wants to hear it or talk about it, but it's what some people say, what wins wars, so.
But this allowed them to stretch that supply line.
Exactly.
Make it work, and they could fight.
Yes, absolutely it did. And Oh, I guess one other thing, you don't hear much about the German horses at all, because Goebbels at the time, he didn't allow for filming anything other than the motorized vehicles. And then apparently after the war, or more recently in video games, horses are harder to animate. And then there's some sort of ruling that if you shoot a horse online, then you become censored. So there was that too. And then you can't talk about the might of the German army without it being mechanized. So there's a lot of confusion about that. So people often forget about the horses. They haven't seen that. So other comments? Well, I will comment on, as Don has mentioned. Oh, yes.
The horse became a food source also, you know.
Oh. I guess if they're that hungry. Yeah, for next month, Don already mentioned the girls who stepped out of line. That will be the speaker there. There, I have the book, The Road to Victory, David Colley. He wrote the book. Don said he had been a speaker at the World War II Roundtable. He also wrote some articles about the Red Ball Express, and then just a comment on the Amsterdam to Berlin tour.
They put